Great. Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Megan. As Megan said, my name is Liz Owens. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Planned Parenthood Association of Utah and Planned Parenthood Action Council of Utah. My work is located in public policy and community organizing.
I'm Katie. I am a volunteer leader and former engagement intern at Planned Parenthood Association of Utah.
And we also don't have any disclosures. So we're here today to talk to you about reproductive justice. We have a short little introduction to the origins and the historical context of reproductive justice theory. It's a movement, it's a practice, and it really is what centers our work as we're out in the community organizing folks to protect reproductive rights and access to reproductive health services. Our main objective today is really to introduce the concept to you and to leave you with a couple of takeaways, which Katie, I think, will explain later. But so to start off, the origins and the historical context of reproductive justice really start with the hundreds of years and thousands of instances of reproductive oppression. So reproductive oppression is the control and exploitation of individuals through our bodies, sexuality, and labor, particularly at the intersections of multiple identities at risk for discrimination, identities such as class, race, and gender. There are thousands of examples across time, and there are several that I've put here. I won't go through each and every one of them, but from enslaved women to indigenous women, and primarily at these intersections, we see a lot of examples of women of color. And reproductive justice and the analysis of reproductive oppression has really come out of two different strains. One of them is the examples of reproductive oppression, and the other is Black women who were mobilizing and organizing around feminist and anti-racist movements, who didn't feel seen in either of those movements, and who had a lot of intellectual debates and conversations around where they fit in as women within women's movements, and as or women within anti-racist movements, and as Black women within mainstream white feminist movements. And all of those sort of came to a head in the 90s. At the International Conference on Population and Development. One of the main concerns at this conference was choice, and there was a lot of conversation about choice. African and African American women caucused at this conference, so they met sort of really naturally on the side and talked about what choice meant for their communities. They really interrogated this idea of choice. What does it mean to be able to have the choice to have children or the choice not to have children? And they felt like this language of choice when describing access to abortion, reproductive health services didn't actually capture the experience of members of their communities and their own lives. And so from the history of reproductive oppression and all of the work that Black feminists were doing to be recognized in women's movements and anti-racist movements and talk about the unique position of Black women at the intersections of both race and gender, these women in 1994 came up with the term reproductive justice, which they felt was much more encompassing of the experiences of members of their communities, and really took into account what it meant for members in their communities to have a choice to have kids or to not have kids. And this is a practice, a theory, and also a movement. In 1997, a lot of women-led organizations, women of color-led organizations, created a network called Sister Song, and an organization came out of that called the Sister Song Collective, which I would refer you to for more information on reproductive justice. They're terrific, and their website is quite comprehensive as well. But Sister Song Collective formed to educate women of color and policymakers on reproductive and sexual health and rights.
So Liz has addressed the kind of context and history behind reproductive justice. So I'm going to talk a bit about the structure of the theory and how that applies. Reproductive justice has three core tenets. So every person has the human right to, one, decide if and when they will have a child and the conditions under which they will give birth. 2, decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. And then 3, this is where we kind of move away from that choice-based framework. Parent the children they already have with the necessary social supports in safe environments and healthy communities, and without the fear of violence from individuals or the government. So reproductive justice really starts with reproductive health at the heart of it. So these are the necessary reproductive health services that all of you are providing to your patients every day. These are incredibly important, but you can't really access or have reproductive health without reproductive rights, without these rights that are constitutionally framed in our courts, framed in our laws, that allow women to and everyone to access these health services, that guarantee that we have a legal right to these health services. But what's a legal right if you can't access it? If the clinic in your neighborhood is shut down now, or if it's too far away and you don't have a car, or if you can't afford the clinic, or you can't take time off of work to go to the clinic. This is where the idea of reproductive justice and reproductive oppression really comes in. So that's going to be that biggest piece that encompasses rights and health. So reproductive oppression is the result of these intersections of multiple oppressions that can't really be alleviated without strategies to address all of them. And that's where reproductive justice comes in, really trying to address all of these intersecting oppressions, create strategies to address all of them at the root, and really create a framework to address every level of oppression.
And this really grounds our work at Planned Parenthood in public policy. I think we see our job as protecting the health services that we provide, as well as reproductive rights. And in order for us to do that, we often ask ourselves this question of what it means to access rights in our communities. So abortion is a constitutionally protected right, but what does that mean for everybody in our communities to be able to access that? Do they have the money? Do they have the resources? Are they able to take the time off of work? Is there a transportation issue? Are there immigration status issues for accessing care? Are there LGBTQ affirmation issues? Are there race and language issues? So we ask ourselves that, and the way that we organize and engage around protecting reproductive rights in our community means that we support Pride festivals. We're working in collaboration with a lot of immigrant justice organizations. We work in collaboration with a lot of race equity organizations and a lot of race equity work, because we know that those are barriers for people in our community to receiving equitable care and also access to reproductive health and rights. So reproductive oppression as a barrier to health access. There's a really great book that's out. I can't think of the author, but it's called Medical Apartheid. So I showed you briefly some highlights from the timeline of reproductive oppression. And in fact, there's also a lot of timelines out there of examples of reproductive oppression over hundreds of years. But what that often results in is that there are many women of color who engage with the healthcare system with distrust and with trauma. And sometimes that's generational trauma, community trauma from knowing the stories of their grandparents, of their ancestors who have been misused and exploited by the healthcare system. And that's the ways in which they're engaging, and that's often a barrier to reproductive oppression when someone's going into a provider and they don't really trust that the provider has their best interests at heart because of who they are, what they look like. But an example that immediately comes to mind that's kind of recent, you may or may not have seen that there's this provider who is sometimes known as the father of modern gynecology. You may have heard of him. Dr. Marion Sims, and there's statues of him. He came up with like treatment to work on fistulas, as well as like I think he designed a speculum. But what we know is that he did that by experimenting on enslaved women, often without any kind clearly without informed consent, but often without any kind of anesthesia or pain medication. And so there has been a movement within a lot of women of color and reproductive justice activists to reframe that history to honor those women. But that's some of the trauma, and there are so many examples. And check out Medical Apartheid, the book, if you're interested. But another barrier is racism. So there's personal, institutional, and systemic expressions of racism. They are built into our systems. People have biases, and often that's based on race. And then there's also the burden, the cumulative burden that affects people who have to deal with the consequences of racism, and that result in poor health outcomes. And there's great evidence to also support this, but that there's, stress and trauma, and it may express itself in headaches and high blood pressure, and so that's also a barrier. And I think, as a person of color engaging in systems and engaging in systems that are primarily white, where providers are almost always white, racism is a consideration and a concern when you feel like you're not being listened to, coupled with knowing the history, familial, generational, community history of misuse by the healthcare system. So that's real and exists as barriers. And then there's also systemic barriers, which we mentioned, like just access to transportation, having the economic means, housing. And when we talk about housing, it's not just access to housing, it's also being able to have access to housing that is clean and healthy, with healthy water and clean air, access to healthy food. Those are all barriers, and if those are your considerations, and perhaps your first considerations, what does it mean when your paycheck's gone because you're trying to get food and pay your rent to access reproductive health care services? And then finally, reproductive health and health in general cannot be separated from the issues that affect the lives of women of color. We really believe that there isn't an issue that women of color face, whether that is economic justice, housing, immigration, whatever it is, that doesn't impact their reproductive health.
So as far as takeaways that we want to leave you with, we have two major ones. First is to understand these three foundational principles of reproductive justice that we've laid out. So again, that's going to be the right to have a child, the right to not have a child, and to raise your children in safe and healthy environments. And second, we want you to understand reproductive oppression as a barrier to reproductive health access. But that barrier, as Liz discussed, doesn't just stop once you get patients in the door. One of the questions in the pretest for the whole REPP course, I believe, talked about the idea of provider coercion, especially around sterilization. And it mentioned who is most vulnerable to this, women of color, homeless women, disabled women, or LGBTQ women. And the answer is all women who are living at the margins. Any of those identities can make you more vulnerable to the idea of provider coercion and sterilization, but all of those identities can also intersect. All of those identities could also belong to one woman. That could all be one person who has those identities and is therefore particularly vulnerable to any sort of coercion from a provider or from, anyone in the healthcare system.
Yeah, and I guess I would just end with in the work that we do, organizing for reproductive justice, particularly a lot of the women of color-led organizations that are organizing for reproductive justice, we believe that access to healthcare services, or the existence of healthcare services and or reproductive rights, aren't ever realized without the justice piece, and that they're not effective. They don't really have meaning in our communities unless there's justice. Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? You can feel free to unmute yourself and type in if you'd like, or feel free to type your questions in the chat box. Anyone in the room have a question?
I just don't want to look everything over.
We were
we were so comprehensive.
Anything else, presenters, you would like to add, or any questions that came up for either of you during the other's presentation?
I think the two presentations worked well together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd say, as Kyle was speaking, so much of it was new and really interesting to me. And also, I think you had mentioned ways in which providers should also think about equitable care, and that speaks to me from not only from the reproductive justice framework, but also just from my lived experience. So thinking about having that threaded into to everything is super important. But so I was back there thinking yes, because that just feels so essential to me. So and is a clear link to reproductive justice.
Okay, if nobody has any questions, I am going to once again encourage you to complete your post-test. You'll be getting an email from me in about 5 minutes. If you have joined today and I don't send you an email, please send me an email letting me know that you were on. My email is meg.waters@utah.edu. And if you have questions for either of these sessions, feel free to shoot the presenters emails. Kyle shared her contact information. You guys have contact. There we go. So feel free to follow up with them if you'd like afterwards. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Awesome.
I have a question. I don't know if you guys can hear me. Sorry. I put it on the little chat feed, but it doesn't look like you guys saw it. I guess it's more directed to Kyle, but you mentioned the PRAM study about how women are asked if it's an unintended pregnancy or an intended pregnancy. How are they recruited to participate in that study?
So I think that there is, let me see if I can hear it. So my understanding of it is it's like a randomized selection of people, who have recently had a baby. They get sent this survey. So it's generalizable to the state of Utah because they select a sample that is representative of populations in the state. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Yeah, I just wasn't sure if it was offered to every woman, if it's something that they're collecting from provider data, or how that works.
No, that's a good question. So it is not sent to every single person who has a baby that year, but it is sent out every year, and it is sent out to just a sample of people who have had babies, and it is the person filling out that survey. So it's not from a provider perspective, it is that person's, and it covers all sorts of different things like their behaviors before pregnancy, relationships, just a lot of different things related to pregnancy and parenting. And so what's really great about our Department of Health is you can go to their website and kind of query the data. And so you can select certain types of variables that you want to look at, certain types of locations that you want to look at. So if you you obviously live in a specific county, but you would be able to look at that local health district and see more in-depth information about the people in your community who had taken that survey, and kind of some snapshots of the aggregate level of their aggregate data.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
We had another question come in for the reproductive justice session. The question is, will there be opportunities for providers to be educated, to be aware of their own biases towards sterilization and coercion? This person thinks that this comes out in conversations with patients because it's not being addressed with providers.
We don't, at least in our, like I said, I'm located in public policy, so we don't have anything coming up or any real specific strategies around providers. we kind of focus on legislators and also community members. The opportunity exists. I mean, it is something definitely that we could explore if there was interest, and we would be open to collaboration. And there's a lot of great resources, not just from our local organization, but there's a lot of great organizations who probably, I mean, I'd say probably something like that exists that I'd be willing to do some research on. If someone wanted to reach out, I'd be happy to collaborate on that.
And we have, so Patty Kaysen is speaking next week, and she's speaking about patient-centered counseling, and she will cover some of these biases, or at least helping providers start to recognize some of these biases. I think step one is going, oh gosh, maybe I have some biases, you know, and then being able to look into that. And so what we can do is we will link some studies that show provider bias and bias in how they are counseling. Often, like it is research shows that providers are more likely to offer long-acting reversible contraception to women of color than they are to white women. And so we can put some of these studies on the website with this session so that people would be able to click on those and read those and learn more. But also, at that Family Planning Elevated conference that's happening in January, there will be attention focused on that. But I think just the first thing is being more aware of it and knowing and acknowledging that people have biases and we do this, and it is going to serve us well to look into the history of oppressions within the industries that we work in and beyond, but especially making sure that we aren't perpetuating things unconsciously or implicitly.
Yeah, I mean, just as an interesting side note, the conversation within Planned Parenthood Federation of America across the country we often have is how in the past and sometimes currently some of our programs to decrease teen pregnancy are focused on communities of color, and often only on communities of color. And those are our own biases as we're constructing programs of who we think needs to decrease teen pregnancy and why. And so we have that conversation, have to face it with ourselves and recognize that and incorporate it into our work.
Yeah. So check back on, we'll make sure that we have some references available for people to start becoming more familiar with.